Chapter 1. The Potato Incident. Posy Wren knew the king was in love with her because his second had accidentally told her so. Not in words, of course. Words were a currency she had never dealt in. It had happened 3 weeks ago, during the painfully long monthly Pack Elders dinner. King Callum Blackwood, the alpha of the Blackwood Dominion, sat at the head of the long oak table, looking every bit the powerful ruler he was supposed to be. His second, Liam Thorne, stood at his right, a pillar of loyal competence. At least, that was the idea. Posy, as the pack's primary weaver, had a designated seat near the hearth, a place of honor that was really just a polite way of keeping the quiet, deaf Omega out of the political crossfire. From her vantage point, she saw everything. She saw Lord Harold Crane's lip curl when the king overruled his suggestion for a more aggressive border patrol. She saw the new kitchen maid tremble as she served the wine. And she saw Liam, in a moment of distraction while the king was speaking, sign a quick, frustrated message to himself. Or so he thought. His hands moved in the new, clumsy dialect of sign language that had been quietly spreading among the castle staff. A dialect originating from one very specific source. He signed, "The king is an idiot." Posy had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. It wasn't just the sentiment, which was amusing enough. It was the specific, practiced rhythm of the signs. The handshape for king was crisp. The sign for idiot was emphatic. It was a complaint honed by repetition. And it told Posy everything she needed to know. For 4 months, King Callum had been learning sign language, in secret. He thought it was a secret anyway. But a king can't have a secret in a castle. The guards who stood outside the royal library late at night heard the thumps of dropped books. The maids who cleaned his study found discarded scraps of parchment with crudely drawn handshapes. And Posy, whose rooms overlooked the library's sprawling gardens, had seen the truth with her own eyes. Twice, she'd been woken by a flicker of light and, drawn to her window, had seen him. King Callum, alone in the vast, silent library, standing before the tall glass windows that reflected the candlelight. He was signing to his own reflection, a look of fierce, agonizing concentration on his face. He was fumbling his way through, "How was your day?" A phrase so simple, and yet his hands moved like he was trying to defuse a bomb. He used the sign for fish instead of day. He jabbed the air with the wrong fingers. His brows were drawn so tight they looked like a single furious line. And it was, without a doubt, the most hopelessly, devastatingly romantic thing she had ever witnessed. Something in her, the part that had spent 23 years watching people from the outside, cataloging every flinch and hesitation and unspoken thought, offered a quiet, definitive assessment. That man is going to hurt himself. He is also trying harder than anyone has ever tried for us. These two facts are equally important. We should pay attention. And then, softer, with the fierce tenderness that had been talking her through every hard day since she was old enough to understand she was different. You deserve someone who tries this hard. Don't you dare look away. So she kept his secret. She pretended not to notice the way his eyes would follow her hands when she signed to her apprentice. She pretended not to see the flash of panic and then determination in his gaze when their paths crossed in the hallways. She let him have his clandestine lessons, his late-night fumbles, his illusion of secrecy. Until today. She was in the great hall, checking the tension on the grand tapestry that depicted the founding of their pack. A sprawling epic of wolves and moons and ancient trees she had spent 3 years weaving. The morning light streamed through the high arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a peaceful, ordinary morning. Then the air shifted. A scent of undisputed authority filled the space. Everything in her went still. Not tense, still. The way she went still when she needed to feel something clearly. And what she felt was him. Every nerve in her skin tracking his approach like a change in weather. Oh, the thought arrived, unhelpfully. Oh, he smells like that up close. We didn't know that. That's going to be a problem. And then, immediately, the fiercer part. Stand up straight. You are extraordinary. He should be nervous, not you. Callum Blackwood did not walk. He strode. He moved with the predatory grace of the wolf inside him, a presence that demanded attention. Every head in the hall turned. Conversations faltered. The king was on the move, and he was heading directly for the quiet Omega Weaver by the tapestry. Posy felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back. She did not turn. She kept her focus on a loose thread, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern of woven silk. She could feel his approach like a change in barometric pressure. He stopped a respectful 5 feet away. Silence descended upon the great hall. For a heart-stopping moment, he just stood there. She could feel his nervousness, a frantic energy radiating from him that was completely at odds with his regal posture. She imagined the war happening behind his eyes, the part of him that ruled a kingdom telling him to speak, to command, to be what everyone expected. And the other part, the honest part, the part that had spent 4 months in a library making a fool of himself, saying simply, "We are afraid. She is right there. Our hands are going to be wrong again." Posy waited. Then, slowly, he raised his hands. They were large hands, scarred on the knuckles from sword practice, and calloused from holding the reins of both a kingdom and a warhorse. They looked impossibly clumsy now, hesitant and unsure. He began to sign. Very slowly, very carefully. Your. He used the sign for yours, but his thumb was in the wrong place, making it closer to potato. Weaving. He fumbled this one badly, his fingers tangling before settling on a shape that vaguely resembled the sign for rock. Is beautiful. The sign for beautiful he almost got, but he closed his hand too early, turning the graceful sweep across the face into a gesture that meant, pretty pig. So, to the letter, the Alpha King of the Blackwood Dominion had just walked across the great hall in front of his entire court to inform a woman he'd never spoken to that her potato rock was a pretty pig. That was the worst thing we have ever witnessed, the thought arrived, with a warmth that completely contradicted the words. He is a disaster, an absolute irredeemable disaster. Look at his face. He knows. He knows he just said potato. And he's still standing there. He's not running. He's waiting. A beat. And then, fiercely. Do you see what he just did for you? In front of everyone? Don't you dare let him stand there alone. Posy's gaze met his. His eyes, the color of warm whiskey, were wide with a mixture of hope and stark terror. He was waiting. He had laid his bumbling, heartfelt, ridiculous effort at her feet, and he was waiting for her to step on it or accept it. A slow warmth spread through her chest. It was absurd. It was mortifying. It was perfect. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she raised her own hands. In contrast to his agonizing slowness, her movements were a blur of fluid grace. A lifetime of silence had made her hands as eloquent as any poet's tongue. At full speed, a torrent of meaning he could never hope to follow, she signed back, "So is your effort." He stared at her, utterly lost. The hope in his eyes flickered, replaced by confusion. He had tried to build a bridge, and she had just driven a high-speed train across it in the other direction. He turned his head, a desperate, pleading look aimed at his second, who had materialized at his side. "Liam?" Callum's voice was a low rumble, tight with strain. Translation? Posy watched Liam Thorne, the king's ever-stoic right hand. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his shoulders were shaking. He looked from the king's baffled face to Posy's calm one. He looked at her hands, now resting at her sides. Then he looked back at his king, and a single, fat tear rolled down his cheek. He cleared his throat. She said, "So is your effort, my king." The meaning of it landed in the silence. The sheer, breathtaking wit of it. The kindness. The acceptance. Not just of the compliment, but of the clumsy, flawed, beautiful attempt. It was not a rejection of his failure to communicate. It was a celebration of his trying. Callum's entire posture seemed to change. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased. The terror in his eyes was replaced by a dawning wave of something so profound it almost buckled his knees. He looked back at Posey, and this time there was no king, no alpha, no ruler of the Dominion. There was just a man. Seen. Truly seen. He raised one hand again. No hesitation this time. The movement was simple, clean, and perfect. Thank you. That one, he got exactly right. Chapter 2. The Honest Problem. Callum felt the flush creep up his neck. It was a hot, prickling wave of humiliation, and the most honest part of his mind, the part that had no use for composure, for masks, for the performance of being king, offered its assessment with brutal clarity. We said potato, in front of everyone. She knows. They all know. We are a man who said potato to the woman we... And then, cutting through the mortification like a blade, she stayed. She understood. That is the only fact that matters right now. He was acutely aware of the 57 pairs of eyes, yes, he'd counted, drilled into his back. The silence in the great hall was so absolute he could hear the frantic pounding of his own heart. It was a tactical disaster. He, who had led armies and negotiated treaties with cunning Fey lords, was being defeated by his own fingers. He had practiced for this moment. For weeks. He'd spent hours in the library, the sign language manual propped open against a stack of historical treaties, his hands cramping as he tried to mimic the diagrams. He'd signed to his reflection until his arms ached. He'd drilled Liam until his second had threatened to abdicate his post and become a goat herder. Liam had insisted on practicing insults. It builds fluency and muscle memory for common handshapes, my king, he'd said with a completely straight face. And it allows me to express my honest counsel in a way that won't get me executed. This was how "the king is an idiot" had become the most fluidly signed phrase in Liam's repertoire. And now, after all that preparation, he'd called her masterpiece a potato rock. The thought that arrived was not a shout. It was quiet, flat, and devastatingly honest. We practiced the wrong things. We memorized the shapes and not the meaning. That is exactly what we always do. Then she'd signed back. A flurry of movement, too quick, too intricate, too overwhelmingly competent for him to even begin to decipher. It was like watching a master swordsman execute a flawless routine while he was still struggling to get his sword out of the scabbard. The look on his face must have been pure desperation, because Liam, bless his long-suffering soul, had appeared as if summoned by the sheer force of his alpha's internal panic. And then Liam had translated, "So is your effort." The words hit him like a physical blow, not of rejection, but of grace. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't pointed out his ridiculous mistakes. She had seen past the clumsy signs, past the potato rock and the pretty pig, and looked directly at the intention behind them. She had seen the hours in the library. She had seen the mortifying drills with Liam. She had seen the king of a nation making himself a fool for a chance, a slim chance that she might see him. She saw us, the thought arrived, stripped of all pretense, not the crown, not the title. Us. The version of us that can't get the sign for day right, and she didn't look away. The relief was so powerful he felt lightheaded. He managed the simple, perfect thank you, pouring every ounce of his gratitude into the single, clean gesture. She inclined her head, a regal gesture for a woman who spent her days with thread and loom, and turned back to her tapestry as if he wasn't there. As if she hadn't just completely dismantled and reassembled his world in the space of 30 seconds. The spell was broken. A cough here, a shuffled foot there, and the great hall slowly came back to life. Callum turned, his regal mask sliding back into place, and strode from the hall without looking back. Liam fell into step beside him, his composure miraculously restored. "That went," Liam began, then wisely trailed off. "It was a calculated risk," Callum said, his voice a low growl. "It was a calculated disaster that was saved by a miracle of feminine grace," Liam corrected gently. "I have already drafted 3 potential apologies, my king. One in writing, one via floral arrangement, and a third involving a public declaration of your idiocy, which I have taken the liberty of pre-signing." "Not necessary," Callum said, a slow smile spreading across his face. He felt buoyant. He had faced the dragon and somehow had not been incinerated. She understood. "She understood you were trying, my king. That is not the same as understanding what you were saying. There is a fine distinction." "And yet," Callum mused, "it feels like the only distinction that matters." They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps echoing in the stone corridor. Lord Crane did not seem pleased, Liam noted, his tone shifting from light-hearted mockery to serious counsel. Callum's good mood didn't fade, but something in him sharpened. Harold Crane was the oldest member of his circle of elders, a man who had served Callum's grandfather, who had held the Dominion together during the border wars when Callum's own father had been too weak to lead. Callum owed him a debt for that. Everyone did. The pack survived because Harold Crane had made hard choices when no one else would. But the world had changed, and Harold hadn't changed with it. He still saw strength in the same narrow terms: sharp swords, aggressive borders, wolves who fit a particular mold. He was watching her, and you. The way a hawk watches a field mouse, Liam said. "He worries," Callum said, and was surprised to find he meant it. He didn't think Harold was simply cruel. The man had lost a daughter, years ago, a girl who had been different, born with a withered leg, they said, a wolf who could never run properly. She'd been mated to a lord from a neighboring pack, a strong, proud wolf who had never once adapted for her. Never learned to slow down, never adjusted, never met her where she was. She had faded, quietly. The way flowers fade when no one remembers to water them. Harold never spoke of her. But Callum had seen the way his face went blank whenever someone in the pack was described as different. It was the blankness of a man looking at a wound he refused to treat. "He believes a king's strength is measured in the sharpness of his sword," Callum said, the words tasting like ash. "And he believes I am making the same mistake someone else made a long time ago." Liam was quiet for a moment. "Is he right?" "No," Callum said, with a certainty that surprised him. "Because I'm not the one who stopped trying." "That is true," the honest thought confirmed. "We have not stopped. We will not stop. But we should acknowledge that we are also terrified. Honesty requires that." "My wolf," Callum said, pinching the bridge of his nose, "is providing unsolicited emotional commentary." "As is his right," Liam said. "My wolf provides unsolicited commentary on your wolf. It's wolves all the way down, my king." They reached the chambers where the elders met. Callum paused at the door, his hand on the heavy iron latch. He thought of Posy's hands, the speed and grace of them. He thought of the look in her eyes. Not pity, not amusement, but a quiet, profound understanding. She hadn't just seen his effort, she'd validated it. She had seen his attempt to step outside the rigid box of what an alpha king was supposed to be, and she had met him there. "Liam," he said, his voice serious, "cancel my afternoon appointments. I need the library." Liam's eyebrows shot up. "More practice, my king?" "No," Callum said, a new resolve hardening his voice. He pushed the door open. "A new strategy." If Harold Crane thought Posy was a weakness, then Harold Crane, for all his years of service and all his hard-earned wisdom, was looking at the world through a dead man's eyes. Callum had just discovered she was a source of strength he hadn't even known he was looking for. And he was going to learn her language. Not just to compliment her weaving, but to listen to everything she had to say. He had a feeling the weaver saw more than anyone else in this castle, and he was determined to be the one she told her secrets to. Chapter 3. The Bridge. Posy felt his departure like the tide going out, leaving the shores of the great hall quiet and still. She kept her eyes on the tapestry, her fingers tracing the path of a silver thread that depicted the river running through their territory. but her senses were stretched, following him. She felt the vibration of his confident footsteps fading through the stone floor. The lower timbre of Liam's voice beside him transmitted through the walls like a distant hum. Her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Okay. That happened. That actually happened. He walked across the entire hall, for us, in front of everyone. He said potato, and he said pig, and he said rock, and it was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever. The thought stumbled over itself, tripping on its own enthusiasm, then caught itself with a sharp self-correction. Composure. We are composure. We don't flail. We are the woman who didn't flinch. Maintain the brand. A beat. Then, softer. But his eyes, though. Did you see his eyes when Liam translated? He looked like a man who'd been drowning and someone threw him a rope. You did that. You did that, you magnificent creature. He called my tapestry a potato rock, Posey thought back, a bubble of silent laughter rising in her chest. Her shoulders shook with it. Details. Irrelevant details. The man learned an entire language for you. Badly. But he learned it. Do you know how many people have ever tried to learn our language? Not to be polite. Not because they had to. Because they wanted to talk to us specifically? The answer, of course, was 0. Until now. Exactly. So we're going to ignore the potato. We're going to focus on the fact that a king, has been standing in front of a mirror at midnight, making his hands do things they clearly do not want to do. For months. Because he wanted to say one sentence to us. One. And it didn't even matter that the sentence was wrong, because the sentence was never the point. Posey ran a hand over the woven face of the first Alpha King, a stern-looking wolf of a man. His eyes, made of black jet, seemed to judge her. For generations, the weavers of her line had been the silent historians of the pack. They saw everything, felt everything, and wove it into the threads of time. They were respected, revered, and utterly ignored. They were fixtures, like the stone walls or the ancient oaks. No one expected them to have opinions. No king had ever tried to speak to one. Not like this. Not with such raw, vulnerable, idiotic effort. She felt a presence at her elbow and turned. It was Nora, her young apprentice, her hands fluttering with questions. Was that? Did the king? To you? Nora signed, her eyes wide as dinner plates. Posey gave her a calm, placating smile and signed back. He was admiring the tapestry. He has an interest in pack history. It was not a lie, just a very, very edited version of the truth. Nora looked unconvinced but knew better than to press. She went back to sorting silks, casting sideways glances at Posey every few seconds. The gossip network, Posey knew, would be operating at maximum capacity by lunch. The king, who had shown polite but distant interest in every eligible high-born daughter paraded before him, had just singled out the deaf Omega Weaver. It was a declaration, a clumsy, half-garbled declaration, but a declaration nonetheless. And it had been made in public, which meant it had been made directly in the line of sight of Lord Harold Crane. Her gaze drifted across the hall to where the old lord still stood, speaking in low tones to two of his allies among the elders. Harold was a man carved from granite and service. He had held the Dominion together when it was falling apart, and he wore that history like armor. He saw the modern world, with its shifting alliances and new ideas, as a sickness he had already cured once and might need to cure again. But it was more than politics with Harold. Everyone knew about his daughter, even if no one spoke of it. A girl born different. A lord who never adapted. A slow, quiet fading. Harold looked at Posey and didn't see a person. He saw a repetition. A pattern he was certain he recognized. A girl who was different and a powerful man who thought love was enough to bridge the gap. In Harold's mind, love was never enough. He'd watched it fail. He'd buried the proof. That one, the thought arrived, sharp and assessing. He's not angry. He's afraid. Can you feel it? Underneath the disapproval, underneath the stiffness, He's terrified. He's watching his daughter die again, and he thinks no one can see it. A beat. Then, with a protectiveness that was all teeth. That doesn't make him safe. A frightened man with power is the most dangerous thing in any room. We watch him. We don't pity him. We watch. I know, Posy thought, her fingers tightening on the tapestry. She had felt his enmity for years, a cold draft in the warm halls of the castle. But now, the king had drawn a line, placing her on one side and men like Harold on the other. He had made her a target. Or, perhaps, he had simply revealed she had been one all along. She spent the rest of the day in her weaving studio, the rhythmic clatter of the loom a comforting percussion. It was her sanctuary, a world she controlled completely. Here, colors spoke louder than voices. Here, she could weave strength and defiance into every thread. She was working on a new piece, a private one not commissioned by the elders. It was a nightscape of the forest surrounding the castle. The trees were dark shades of indigo and violet, but she was weaving the moonlight in threads of pure, shimmering silver. In the center of the forest, half hidden in the shadows, she was weaving two wolves. One was a massive, dark-furred alpha, his head thrown back in a silent howl. The other, a smaller, sleeker wolf the color of cream, stood beside him, watching. Her presence a quiet anchor. She didn't know why she was weaving it. The image had simply appeared in her mind one day and demanded to be made real. You know exactly why you're weaving it, the thought murmured. You've known for weeks. You're just not ready to say it out loud yet. That's okay. We'll wait. We're very patient. We are extremely patient. We have been patient for 23 years, and we can be patient for 23 more if that's what you need. But also, you're weaving his wolf next to yours, so maybe let's not pretend we don't know what's happening here. As dusk fell, Nora brought her a tray with bread and cheese, signing a quick goodnight before hurrying away. The castle grew quiet. Posy ate, her mind churning. Callum's gesture had changed everything. The comfortable distance she had maintained was gone. He had crossed the silence between them. Now she had to decide what to do on his side of the bridge. He crossed for us, the fierce thought insisted. No one has ever crossed for us. We have been on our side of every bridge our entire life, and no one has ever once thought to walk over. And now this man, this ridiculous, potato-signing, midnight-practicing, terrified, brave man, has crossed. And we're just going to stand here? A gift. The idea took root. What could she give a king who had everything? Not gold, not power. He had those in abundance. She had to give him something only she could. A piece of her world. Later that night, long after the moon had risen, she found herself walking the silent garden paths. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the rose bushes. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked up at the library. One window was lit, a warm, golden square against the dark stone. He was there, she knew it. She slipped through the shadows, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the flagstones, until she was standing beneath the window. She couldn't see him, but she could feel him. A restless, concentrated energy radiating through the stone. And then she felt it. A soft thud transmitted through the wall. A vibration she had come to recognize. The frustrated impact of a heavy book hitting a table. And faintly, through the stone, the rumble of a voice. She couldn't hear the words. She never could. But she felt the cadence of frustration, the sharp edge of a man at war with his own hands. She smiled. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment and a bit of charcoal. Leaning against the cold stone wall, she quickly sketched. It wasn't the clumsy diagrams from his book. It was her hand, her own hand, forming the sign for beautiful. She drew the elegant curve of the fingers, the sweep of the thumb, the way the wrist had to turn just so. She added small arrows indicating the motion. It was a piece of her language offered freely. Then she crept to the small side door the gardeners used, a door she knew was never locked. She slipped inside, her heart hammering. The library was just down the hall. She could leave the note on the door. He would find it in the morning. It was safe. It was distant. It was what she had always done. No, the thought commanded. Fierce, absolute. Not on the door. For him. Now. And then, softer, the voice that had been her only companion through every silent year. You have been brave in small ways your entire life. Brave in ways no one noticed, because bravery without sound is invisible. But this, walking through that door, handing him a piece of yourself, this is the kind of brave that changes things. And you deserve to change things. You have earned this. Now move your feet. Holding the small parchment in her hand like a shield, she started walking toward the light. Callum growled and threw the book onto the table. It landed with a satisfyingly loud smack. This is useless, he announced to the empty library. It is not the book that is useless, the thought arrived, flat and factual. It is us. We are the problem. The book is doing its best. Thank you for that, Callum muttered. He paced the length of the Aubusson rug. The book, An Introduction to Unified Sign, was dry, academic, and utterly devoid of the fluid poetry he had seen in Posey's hands. It reduced something living to a series of mechanical instructions. Form handshape 4B, move from chin point to cheek point. It was a recipe for assembling furniture, not a way to tell a woman she was the most captivating creature he'd ever seen. We cannot tell her that, the thought observed mildly. We said potato. We are not ready for captivating. We should master hello first, properly. He'd been at it for hours. He'd mastered hello, goodbye, and a dozen ways to ask for the location of the nearest lavatory. He could, with some concentration, sign the entire pack charter, but the words he wanted, the words he needed, were stuck. They felt like rocks in his mouth and turned into clumsier rocks on his hands. He should be mortified. He should be ordering Liam to find a remote, uninhabited island where he could live out the rest of his days as a hermit. Instead, he felt energized. Her response, "So is your effort," had replayed in his mind 1,000 times. It means she has been watching us, the thought noted. She knew about the library. She knew about the practice. She saw all of it. We were never secret. We were only private enough that she could pretend not to notice. That is something. That is kindness we have not earned. He slumped into the big chair by the fire. The cushions were plump, and he sank into them with the weariness of a man who had spent the day being a king and the evening being a student and failing at both. He stared into the dying embers. His father had been a king of silences. He'd ruled with grim pronouncements and unspoken threats. He'd loved his queen, Callum's mother, but he had never learned her language, the language of music and laughter. He had let her fade, a bright bird in a gilded cage, until her song went quiet for good. We are afraid, the thought said, with the simple clarity that made it impossible to ignore, that we are our father. That we will try and it will not be enough, that she will fade. That is the real fear. Not the potato, not the public embarrassment. The fear is that we will love her and fail her anyway. Callum closed his eyes. The thought, his own thought, the part of him that could never perform or pretend, was right. It was always right. That was the problem with having a mind that refused to lie to itself. I won't let that happen, he said aloud, to no one. Then learn faster, the thought replied. And not from the book, from her. He was so lost in thought that he didn't register the door creaking open. He didn't register the whisper-soft footfalls on the rug, but something in him did. A sudden, electric awareness that traveled up his spine and made every hair on his arm stand on end. Someone is here. Small. Quiet. Smells like... His entire body went rigid. Her. She is here. In our space. She came to us. Callum froze. His heart, which had been beating at a slow, contemplative rhythm, kicked into a frantic gallop. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Was he dreaming? We are not dreaming. She is 12 feet away. She is holding something. She is also terrified. Do not move. Do not scare her. We are large and she is not, and this is her choice to be here. Let it be her choice. He slowly, carefully turned his head. She was standing just inside the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. A dark shawl was wrapped around her shoulders, and her silver blonde hair seemed to capture the light. She looked like a creature from a legend, a moon spirit gracing his library with her presence. And she looked absolutely terrified. Her eyes were wide, and she was clutching a small piece of parchment in her hand like it was the only thing anchoring her to the floor. He had the overwhelming urge to do something, anything, to put her at ease. But what? If he spoke, she wouldn't hear him. If he tried to sign, he'd probably declare his love for a piece of furniture. Do nothing, the honest thought instructed. This is the hardest thing we can do, and also the only right thing. She came here. Let her come the rest of the way. Be still. Be safe. Be the place she chose to walk toward. So he did the hardest thing he could possibly do. He stayed silent. He waited. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the vast expanse of the library. The silence was thick with unspoken things. Then, she took a hesitant step forward. And another. She moved with a silent grace that made his own heavy presence feel oafish. She stopped in front of his chair, still holding that little piece of parchment. She was close enough now that he could see the fine silver threads in her hair, the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. She smelled of soap and lavender and something uniquely her. A scent that made every part of him want to lean closer. And also stay perfectly, carefully still. We are going to remember this moment for the rest of our life, the thought said quietly. Whatever she is about to give us. We are going to remember standing here, being this afraid and this grateful at the same time. She held out the parchment to him. He took it, his large calloused fingers brushing against hers. A jolt shot up his arm. Not supernatural, not fate, just the raw physical fact of contact with someone who mattered. His eyes flashed gold for a half second, an involuntary reaction he couldn't control. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. He looked down at the parchment. It was a drawing, a simple, elegant sketch of a hand. Her hand. It was forming the sign for beautiful, the one he had so thoroughly butchered. Arrows indicated the fluid motion he had failed to capture. It was a correction, a lesson, a gift. She is teaching us, the thought said, and for once it was not flat, not analytical, not merely honest. It was odd. She is giving us the word we got wrong. She is saying, try again. I will show you how. He looked up from the drawing to her face. Her expression was careful, guarded, but her eyes were shining. He understood. This was her crossing the bridge to meet him. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low. Thank you. She couldn't hear the words, but she watched his lips move. She saw the sincerity in his eyes. A small smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a hesitant, fragile thing, but it transformed her face. And in that moment, Callum Blackwood, Alpha King of the Dominion, understood something with perfect clarity. Not because fate told him, not because a bond declared it, but because he had eyes, and she was standing in front of him, and she had walked through a dark castle, alone, to hand him a piece of paper. He wanted to be worthy of that walk. He looked back at the drawing, then at his own hand. He tried to mimic the shape, the posture. It was still clumsy, still stiff. She watched him, her head tilted. Then she reached out. Her hand, small and warm, covered his. She gently adjusted his fingers, moving his thumb into the correct position, guiding his hand through the graceful sweeping motion. She was teaching him. Her touch was light, but it burned like a brand. His entire being was focused on the point of contact, on her warmth, on her proximity. The library, the kingdom, Harold Crane, it all faded away. This, the honest thought said simply, this is what we were practicing for. Not the sign, this. Her hand on ours. Being taught instead of teaching. following instead of leading. This is the thing we didn't know we needed. When she finished, his hand was still tingling. He looked at her, and this time, he didn't need words or signs. He let her see the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes. The gratitude, the awe, the fierce, protective wave of affection that was so strong it almost choked him. She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. She had seen it, and she had not run away. She took a step back, breaking the contact, and the air rushed back into Callum's lungs. She gave him another small smile, turned, and slipped out of the library as silently as she had come, leaving him alone with a piece of parchment and a heart that was beating a whole new rhythm. He looked down at his hand, the hand she had touched, and slowly, carefully, signed the word, beautiful. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Chapter 5. The Warning. Posy didn't stop moving until she was back in the safety of her own rooms, the heavy oak door shut and bolted behind her. She leaned against it, her body trembling. Her lungs burned, and she realized she had been holding her breath almost the entire time. She had done it. She had walked into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a piece of paper, and had come out unscathed. More than unscathed. She had come out hopeful. You did it. You did it. I am so proud of you I could scream. If we screamed, which we don't. But internally, I am screaming. Did you see his face? When you touched his hand? His eyes went gold. Gold. For us. The king of the entire dominion lost control of his own eyeballs because we touched his fingers. We are devastating. A beat. Then with a sudden pivot to tactical, also his hand was warm, very warm, large. We should think about what that means. Actually, no, we should not think about what that means right now because we need to sleep. And if we start thinking about his hands, we will not sleep. And tomorrow is weaving day, and we need steady fingers and… Stop, Posy thought, a fresh wave of heat rising in her cheeks. She could still feel the rough texture of his skin, the warmth of his hand under hers. He was so large, solid, a being of immense power who had allowed her, a quiet omega, to guide him, to teach him. When their skin had touched, something had shifted. Not a supernatural revelation, not a bond snapping into place. Something simpler and harder to name. A recognition. The feeling of finding a piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. I know what it was, the thought offered gently, the snark falling away for a rare, honest moment. It was the first time in our life someone made space for us. Not around us, not politely ignoring us, for us. He sat there, and he was still, and he waited, and he let us come to him. No one has ever done that. No one has ever been that careful with us. The thought paused. Then, we deserve careful. We have always deserved careful. I have been telling you this for 23 years, and now there is proof, and his name is Callum, and he smells like pine. Posy walked over to her loom, her fingers tracing the half-finished image of the two wolves. The silver thread of the moonlight seemed to glow in the darkness. She had been weaving a fantasy, a dream. Now it felt like something closer to a decision. Her quiet life was over. The king had seen her, and now others would look too. Some, like Nora, with curiosity. Others, like Harold Crane, with something more complicated than malice. She thought of the old lord, his face at dinner. Not cruel, haunted. A man looking at a ghost only he could see. He lost someone, the thought acknowledged, its tone shifting to something careful. Someone like us. And he's decided the lesson of that loss is that people like us don't survive people like Callum. He's wrong. But he's wrong in the way that comes from having watched someone he loved die. That's the most dangerous kind of wrong there is, the kind that feels like wisdom. I know, Posy thought. He's not just a man who wants to stop us. He's a man who thinks he's saving us. Which means he won't stop. Not because he's evil, because he's convinced he's right. People who think they're saving you will burn down every bridge you've built and call it protection. She had spent her life being invisible, finding safety in the silence. That safety was gone. If she wanted this, if she wanted him, she would have to fight for it. And not just with her loom. The next day, the castle was buzzing. Posy felt it the moment she stepped out of her rooms. The guards straightened a little too quickly. The servants scurrying past shot her wide-eyed, curious glances. She was no longer just Posy Wren, the weaver. She was the Omega who had caught the king's eye. She kept her head high, her expression serene, giving nothing away. Inside, her stomach was a knot of anxiety. Chin up, shoulders back. You are not a woman who got noticed. You are a woman who has always been worth noticing. The only thing that changed is that someone finally had the sense to look. Everyone else was late. That is their problem. She made her way to the great hall, half expecting to see Callum there, waiting to attempt another mortifyingly public conversation. But the hall was empty, save for a few servants clearing away breakfast. Disappointment warred with relief. He's being strategic, the thought assessed. He's not crowding us. He's giving us room. That is annoyingly mature of him. We were hoping for another potato. For entertainment purposes only. Her reprieve was short-lived. As she was approaching her weaving studio, a figure stepped into her path. Lord Harold Crane. Alone this time, no allies flanking him. He was a tall, lean man with a face like a hawk and eyes that missed nothing. He did not attempt to sign. He never did. He simply spoke, slowly and deliberately, facing her so she could catch the shapes of the words on his mouth. It was not kindness. It was a way of forcing her to work for every sentence, to operate on his terms. Mistress Wren, a word, if you please. Posy inclined her head, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She waited. Careful, the thought warned, all snark gone. He's alone. That's deliberate. No witnesses means no consequences for whatever he's about to say. Watch his hands, his jaw, the vein in his temple. He's carrying something, and it's heavy. The elders have noted the king's particular interest in your work of late, Harold began, his voice measured, not dripping with condescension this time, almost gentle, which was worse. It is gratifying to see the ancient arts appreciated. He paused. His jaw worked, as if the next words cost him something. However, I say this not as an elder, but as a man who has lived long enough to see certain patterns repeat. His eyes found hers, and for a moment the mask slipped. Underneath the authority and the granite, she saw it, a raw, old grief. Some differences cannot be bridged, Mistress Wren, no matter how sincere the effort, no matter how pure the intention. The world is not kind to those who try. It was not a threat, it was a warning. And it was coming from a place so painful she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He's telling us his daughter's story, the thought said quietly. And he doesn't even know he's doing it. He thinks he's being practical. He thinks he's being wise. He is bleeding all over us and calling it advice. Posy met his gaze, her own expression a placid mask. She let the silence stretch. Then she raised her hands. She signed slowly, deliberately. A bridge that is never attempted cannot be called impossible. Only untested. Harold's jaw tightened. He couldn't read the signs, but he could read the calm, unshakable certainty in her eyes. And she could see, in the flicker of his expression, that her steadiness frightened him more than defiance would have. I hope you are right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I truly do. He turned and walked away. His back was straight, his stride measured. But Posy felt the vibration of his footsteps through the stone, and they were unsteady. He means it, the thought said, surprised. He actually hopes we're right. He just doesn't believe it. And he's going to act on what he believes, not what he hopes. Remember that. Before Posy could process the exchange, a new presence arrived. A scent of pine and authority. And then Callum was there, striding around the corner with Liam at his heels. He slowed when he saw her, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that suggested he already knew something had happened. "Lord Crane," he said, not a question. He'd seen the old man leaving. Posey gave him a small nod. Callum's expression hardened for a moment, then softened as he looked at her. He hesitated, then his eyes lit up. He turned to Liam. "The roses." "My king?" "Your prize-winning crimson glories. I believe Mistress Wren's weaving studio could use a splash of color, don't you?" Liam's face went through several stages of grief. His roses were his secret passion. He guarded them more jealously than the crown jewels. "But my king, they are not yet at their peak. They will be a gesture of the crown's deep appreciation for the arts, Liam. See to it." Callum gave Posey a quick, almost shy smile, and then he was gone, leaving a flabbergasted second and a stunned Omega in his wake. Posey looked at Liam. His face was a picture of comical despair. He looked at the retreating back of his king, then at Posey, then back at his king. He let out a long, suffering sigh and finally looked at her, his hands moving in a gesture of pure, unadulterated resignation. "The king is a tyrant." Posey couldn't help it. A real, actual laugh escaped her. Not a sound, never a sound, but a shake of her shoulders and a wide, unguarded grin. The kind of laugh that lived in the body instead of the throat. Liam stared at her, his jaw slack. Then a slow smile spread across his own face. He gave her a small, conspiratorial wink. "He's a good one," the thought said approvingly. "The second. He signs insults and grows roses and he's still here. People who stay are the ones who matter. The king might be a tyrant, but it seemed he was a tyrant they were both growing quite fond of." Chapter 6. The Stones. Callum found himself in the library again that night, but this time he wasn't practicing signs. He was researching. He pulled down dusty tomes on pack law, on the history of Omegas in their lineage, on the sacred role of the weavers. He learned that in ancient times, the weavers were not just historians, but seers. Their tapestries were said to hold prophecies, their hands guided by the moon itself. The position had been relegated to a ceremonial one over the centuries, its power forgotten, but the old laws were still there. An Omega weaver's testimony was considered unimpeachable in matters of pack history and lineage. "We are looking for weapons," the honest thought observed, "legal ones. We are preparing for a fight we hope won't happen by finding ammunition in old books. This is either wise or paranoid." "It's both," Callum murmured. "Agreed. That's usually how it works with us." The idea was still half-formed when a soft knock came at the library door. Callum looked up, surprised. Only Liam would dare disturb him at this hour. "Enter." The door opened, but it wasn't Liam. It was Nora, Posey's young apprentice. She stood in the doorway, twisting a piece of cloth in her hands, her eyes wide with fear. Callum softened his expression. "Come in, Nora. Don't be afraid." He signed a careful hello. She responded with a fluid one and scurried into the room. She held out a sealed scroll. "From Mistress Wren," she signed, her hands trembling. She said, "It is urgent." Callum's blood ran cold. Urgent. Posey was not a woman given to dramatics. If she said it was urgent, it was. He broke the seal and unrolled the parchment. It wasn't a letter. It was a diagram. A detailed map of the castle's lower levels, the forgotten storerooms and old tunnels near the foundations. And in the corner, a message, written in Posey's neat, precise script. "Lord Crane met with a man I did not recognize. Tonight. Here." An X marked a disused wine cellar. They spoke of the Moon Summit. They spoke of the Silver Creek pack. The man gave Lord Crane a pouch. It was heavy, not coin. Callum stared at the map. The Moon Summit was in 2 weeks. It was a gathering of all the major packs in the region, a delicate dance of diplomacy and posturing. The Silver Creek pack were their oldest rivals. A secret meeting? An exchange? It smelled of treason. Harold Crane, the thought said, and there was something like sadness in it. The man who held this pack together when our father couldn't. The man who taught us how to read a room before we could read a book. He is betraying us. And the worst part is that he probably doesn't think he is. How could Posey possibly know this? The lower levels were deserted at night. No one would have been there to see or hear. He looked at Nora, who was watching him with terrified eyes. He pointed to the map, then touched his ear. Then made a questioning gesture. How? Nora shook her head vehemently. Not here. Feel, she signed. The stones. Mistress Posey feels them. The vibrations. The anger. She followed the feeling. Callum stared at her, his mind reeling. She cannot hear, the thought said slowly. And because she cannot hear, she feels everything else. She has been reading this castle her entire life. Every lie, every argument, every secret meeting conducted in whispers, she felt them in the walls. She is the most observant person in this building, and no one knew because they were too busy deciding she was limited. He looked at Nora. Tell Mistress Wren. Thank you. And stay safe, he signed, his movements sharp with urgency. She nodded, her fear replaced by a glimmer of pride, and scurried away. Callum looked at the map one last time. Harold Crane, the man who had called Posey a pattern destined to repeat. The man who thought he was being practical, while his grief drove him to sabotage the very pack he'd once saved. The Silver Creek deal wasn't treason in Harold's mind, Callum realized. It was insurance. A backup alliance for the day Callum's softness, his focus on trade and infrastructure, his attention to a deaf Omega, his refusal to rule through fear, inevitably led the pack to ruin. Harold was so certain that love made leaders weak that he was willing to hand leverage to their greatest rival to prove it. He was trying to save the pack from its own king. And the bitter, tragic irony was that his certainty came from watching his own daughter die because a powerful man hadn't bothered to try. Harold had learned exactly the wrong lesson. The lesson wasn't that different people couldn't be loved well. The lesson was that his daughter's mate hadn't loved well enough. And instead of understanding that, Harold had decided the problem was the difference itself. We are sad about this, the thought admitted. We would prefer this to be simple, an enemy we could hate. But he is a man who buried a daughter and drew the wrong map from her grave. We can be sad and still stop him. Liam, Callum roared, and his second appeared so quickly he must have been waiting just outside the door. My king? Get the guard. Quietly. We're going to the cellars. He paused at the door. And Liam, this stays quiet until we know what we're dealing with. No rumors, no public arrests. Not yet. Because if we do this loudly, the thought supplied, Harold's allies will claim we were the aggressors. We need the truth to speak for itself. And we need Posey nowhere near the fallout until we know what shape it takes. Posey hadn't just given him information. She had trusted him with it. She had trusted him to believe her, to act. She had taken the biggest risk of her life. For him. For the pack. She trusted us, the thought said, and this time, the honesty wasn't brutal or flat. It was something softer, something that sounded almost like wonder. No one has ever trusted us with something this important before. We will not waste it. I know, Callum said. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword. He was no longer just a king trying to learn a language. He was a man who had been trusted, and who intended to be worth it. Chapter 7. The Wait. Posey waited. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to retreat back into the comfortable anonymity of her silent world. But she had sent the message. She had thrown her stone into the dark pool of castle politics, and now she had to wait for the ripples. Her studio felt like a cage. The familiar clatter of the loom was absent, the silence in the room oppressive. She paced back and forth, her hands twisting in the folds of her dress. Okay, we're pacing. We're doing the pacing thing. This is fine. Pacing is productive. Pacing burns energy. Pacing is not productive at all, actually. We're just wearing a groove in the floor and catastrophizing. Let's list what we know. Facts only. Go. I sent the message. Callum has it. Either he believes me or he doesn't. He believes us. He will believe us. The man spent 4 months learning sign language from a book because he wanted to say one sentence to us. That is not a man who dismisses what we have to say. That is a man who will turn this castle inside out to verify every word because he knows that we do not waste words. We have never in our life wasted a single word. We have too few of them to waste. She had followed the vibrations. It was a skill she had honed since childhood. When the world of sound had faded, or rather, had never existed for her at all, a different world had opened, the world of touch, of feeling. She could feel the shift in the air when a storm was coming, feel the lie in a person's heart through the frantic tremor of their pulse against a handshake, feel the ancient history of the castle in the very stones beneath her feet. Tonight, the stones had been screaming. A discordant thrum of anger and grief and something harder, calculation, emanating from the cellars below. She had followed it, her hand trailing against the cold, damp wall until she was standing directly above the source. And she had felt. Not with her ears. She had no ears, not in any way that mattered. With her whole body. She'd felt the deep, rumbling cadence of Harold's voice. She knew his rhythm, heavy and deliberate, like a man who weighed every word before releasing it. And the sharp, clipped vibrations of the stranger's. She'd felt the heavy clink of the pouch as it was passed, a dead, dense sound. Gold, she was sure of it. A payment. For what? The fragments she'd pieced together were terrifying. She knew Harold's vibration pattern, the heavy, measured cadence he used when he was delivering a verdict rather than having a conversation. She knew the weight of gold from years of handling thread-wrapped weights on her loom, the specific dead thud of dense metal changing hands. And she had crept down to the cellar corridor itself, pressing herself against the wall until she found a gap in the old stones where candlelight leaked through. There she had watched, Harold's mouth forming shapes she could catch in fragments. Moon Summit, Silver Creek. The stranger's hands passing the pouch. An arrangement. Harold wasn't selling out the pack. He was building a safety net, one that would catch them when, in his mind, Callum's reign faltered. And Posey was the proof he would use to justify it. A lovesick king distracted by a deaf Omega Weaver. In Harold's narrative, she wasn't the target. She was the evidence. And that, the thought said, is the most insulting part. He's not even afraid of us. He doesn't think we matter enough to be dangerous. He thinks we're a symptom. We are going to enjoy very much being the cure. The minutes stretched into an hour. The castle remained silent. Then, a vibration through the floor. Footsteps, fast, purposeful. One set heavy, one set lighter. A sharp rap on her door, hard, urgent. Her heart hammered. She crossed the room and opened it. Liam. His face was grim, his tunic rumpled. He stepped inside and quickly bolted the door behind him. He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, profound respect. He raised his hands, and for the first time his signing was not clumsy or mocking. It was clean, efficient, and serious. It is done. Crane is confined to his quarters under guard. The Silver Creek emissary is in the dungeons. They found the gold. You were right about everything, Posey. Everything. She stared at him, the words taking a moment to register. Done. He had believed her. He had acted. The relief was so overwhelming she felt dizzy. The king? She signed, her hands shaking. Is he safe? Liam's expression softened. He is safe. He is furious. And asking for you. Before Posey could process this, Liam continued. There is more. Crane did not act alone. He has sympathizers among the elders. Some of them genuinely believe what he believes. That you are a distraction. That the king is weakening. They are not traitors. but they are not allies either. When this comes before the full circle of elders, they will try to frame this as the king acting rashly, persecuting an old man for having concerns. They'll use me, Posey signed. Liam nodded. They'll say the king is compromised, that he trusts the word of an Omega Weaver over a man who held the Dominion together for 30 years. And they would have a point, Posey signed, surprising him. Harold Crane did hold this pack together. That's real. That matters. If Callum ignores that history, he looks like exactly what Harold says he is. A young king who throws away the old because he found something new. Liam stared at her. Then a slow, grim smile crossed his face. You, he signed, are going to be terrifying as queen. I'm not queen, Posey signed back. Yet, Liam replied. He delivered the rest quickly. The elders would convene in the morning to hear the evidence. Callum wanted her there, not on the sidelines, with him. He says the elders need to see what he sees, Liam signed. That you are not the weakness Harold thinks you are. Posey took a deep breath, pushing down the fear. Tell him I'll be there, she signed. She walked to her loom and with a sharp knife cut the silver wolf from her unfinished tapestry. It was a small, palm-sized square of weaving, the moonlight threads shimmering in the dim light. She pressed it into Liam's hand. Give this to the king. Liam looked down at the tiny woven wolf, then back at her. He nodded once, tucked it carefully inside his tunic, and left. That was our best thread, the thought said softly. The silver moonlight thread. The one that took us 3 tries to get right. And we just cut it out and gave it away. I know. Good. That's how you know it mattered. The things that cost us are the things that count. Chapter 8. The Weaver Sees. The Elder's chamber was a wolf pit. Callum could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Harold Crane's sympathizers, not a unified bloc, but a scattering of older wolves who had served with Harold during the border wars and carried those scars as credentials, were restless. They hadn't rallied behind treason. They had rallied behind a man they respected, a man who had earned their trust with blood and sacrifice, and they were not ready to believe he had broken it. Lord Thorne, no relation to Liam, a coincidence Liam found personally offensive, was the loudest. There must be an explanation, Thorne insisted, his voice carrying the weight of genuine confusion. Harold Crane built this pack. He held us together when there was nothing to hold. This is not a man who betrays. The gold was in his quarters, Thorne, Callum said, his voice even. He was not going to shout. He was not going to roar. He had spent the entire night thinking about what Posey had said to Liam. Harold Crane did hold this pack together. That's real. That matters. She was right. If he treated Harold like a simple villain, he would lose the very people he needed to keep. Gold can be planted, another elder muttered. The Silver Creek emissary confirmed the arrangement, under oath. Under duress, perhaps. Callum felt the familiar pull, the instinct to bare his teeth, to use the weight of his authority to crush dissent. His wolf nature registered these challenges as threats and wanted to respond accordingly. They are afraid, the honest thought observed. They are not defending treason. They are defending the idea that a man they trusted for 30 years was who they thought he was. If Harold Crane is a traitor, then their own judgment is in question. That is what they are really fighting. He was right. They weren't Crane's allies. They were their own. The doors to the chamber opened. Every head turned. Posey Wren walked in. She was not dressed in her simple weaver's clothes. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, the color of the twilight sky. Her silver blonde hair was braided with silver ribbons. She walked with a quiet, unshakable dignity, her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers and stares. She came to a stop at the foot of the dais, at his side. A murmur went through the room. An Omega standing with the Alpha at an elders' assembly? It had never been done. She has no voice here, Thorne said, but his tone was uncertain rather than aggressive. He was looking at her with the uncomfortable expression of a man who had never been forced to consider her as anything other than background. "She has the voice of every weaver who came before her," Callum said, "and she has information that none of you do. You will listen." He turned to Posey. In front of everyone, he raised his hands. His signs were still not fluid, but they were clear and deliberate. "Tell them what you found. I will translate. They need to hear it from you." Posey looked at him, looked at the elders, looked at the room full of powerful wolves who had spent her entire life treating her as furniture. "This is it," the thought said, and for once it was not rambling, not coaching, not cheerleading. It was steady, calm, the voice of something that had been preparing for this moment for 23 years. Everything we have ever seen, everything we have ever felt through those stones, every lie we catalogued, every shift in the air we registered while they all looked past us. This is what it was for, not to survive, to matter. "Show them." She raised her hands. "Lord Crane is not a traitor," she began. Callum translated, his voice steady. The room went silent. "He is a father who buried a daughter," Posey continued, her signs precise and unhurried. "A daughter who was different. A daughter who was mated to a man who never learned to meet her where she was. She faded. She died. And Lord Crane decided that the lesson of her death was that different people cannot be loved well. That the gap is always too wide. That trying only makes the falling worse." The silence in the room was absolute. Even Thorne had gone still. He looked at me and saw his daughter. He looked at the king and saw his daughter's mate. He was so certain the story would end the same way that he decided to protect the pack from what he believed was coming. A weakened king, a failing alliance, a dominion led by a man too distracted by love to see the threat at his borders. She paused, let the weight settle. The Silver Creek arrangement was not an act of malice. It was an act of grief. Harold Crane has been grieving for 20 years and calling it duty. And his grief led him to hand our enemies the means to destroy us. Because in his mind, we were already destroyed. By me. Callum watched the faces of the elders. He saw Harold's sympathizers looking stricken. He saw understanding dawning where certainty had been. "But he was wrong," Posey signed, and now there was steel in her movements. "Not because his grief isn't real, it is. Not because his daughter's death doesn't matter, it does. He was wrong because he learned the wrong lesson. His daughter didn't die because she was different. She died because no one tried. No one adapted. No one crossed the bridge." Her gaze found Callum's for a moment, then she looked back at the elders. The king crossed. He has been crossing for 4 months, alone, in a library, making a fool of himself for a language he may never master. And I crossed back. That is not weakness. That is the thing Lord Crane's daughter never got, and I will not let his grief take it from me. She lowered her hands. The room was silent for a long, breathless moment. Then Lord Thorne, the loudest objector, the man who had been Harold's staunchest defender, slowly rose from his chair. He was pale. He looked at Posey with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. He bowed, a deep, formal bow of respect. One by one, the others followed. "They see us," the thought whispered. And for once, there were no jokes, no snark, no coaching. Just a small, warm glow of something that felt like, finally. Callum reached down and took her hand. His large, calloused fingers closed around her smaller ones. He held up the small woven woof she had sent him, the silver moonlight thread catching the light. "The weaver sees what we miss," he said to the room. "She has always seen it. We were just too loud to notice." He looked down at Posey, and what she saw in his eyes was not the gratitude of a king whose kingdom had been saved. It was something simpler, something that had nothing to do with politics or power. "We are going to learn every word," the honest thought said, and it wasn't speaking to the room, or the elders, or the kingdom. It was speaking to her. Every sign, every gesture. We are going to learn the language of the woman who walked through a dark castle alone to save us. And we are never going to stop learning. Not because we have to, because she is worth every wrong word and every clumsy hand and every potato we say along the way. Later, after Harold Crane had been led away, not to the dungeons but to guarded quarters, his fate to be decided with the care his years of service demanded, Callum found Posy in her studio. The room was quiet, the only movement the soft whisper of her hands as she repaired the spot on her tapestry where she had cut out the wolf. He came and stood beside her. He didn't speak, he just watched her work, his heart full to bursting. After a long moment, she turned to him. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "What now?" He smiled, a slow, easy smile. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. Then, slowly, carefully, with the concentration of a man defusing a bomb, he began to sign. "Now, you teach me the word for forever." Posy looked at his clumsy, earnest hands, at the warmth shining in his eyes. And for the first time in her life, something broke loose from the silence, a small, involuntary sound. Not a word, not a laugh. Something deeper and more raw. Something her body made without her permission because the feeling was too large to hold inside. She didn't know what it sounded like. She would never know. But she saw Callum's face when he heard it. The way his eyes widened, the way his breath caught, the way he looked at her as if she had just given him something priceless and fragile and impossible. That sound, the thought said softly, was ours. Only ours. We have never made it before, and we may never make it again, and he heard it. He is the only person in the world who has ever heard us make a sound. And look at his face. Look at his face. He is going to carry that sound for the rest of his life. And as he pulled her into his arms, she felt the steady, certain beat of his heart against her cheek, and she knew, not because fate decreed it, not because a bond demanded it, but because she had chosen and been chosen in return, that they had all the time in the world to learn.